Well, I'm so excited to have this time with you, my friend Yvonne, and very excited to introduce you to this community and being a part of our learning to listen. I know just being the age we are in the season of our lives and walking with Jesus the length of time that we have, our ears have been open to hear. And we've visited about this over the last year, that we're continuing to listen and continuing to learn. So I'm so thrilled that you are a part of this series. And I just would love for you to share a bit about yourself. You can share about your history in dance or whatever you feel like gives a good introduction to who you are. So thank you for being a part.
Well, you're very welcome. And before I even get started, I just want to thank you publicly and honor you publicly for taking on these kinds of projects, for using social media for a really significant way, in a significant way that makes this sort of camaraderie and this sort of communication available to everyone that has an ear to hear. So anyway, because I know this takes work, your questions are very thought-provoking, and so I know that it takes time to offer something that seems so effortless, just to plug in on social media. But anyway, thank you, my friend. I love the way that you are working this in such a powerful way for the next generation.
Thank
So
you. Appreciate
anyway,
that.
thank you. And I'm sure there are many out there that want to thank you as well, but I wanted to thank you out loud.
Thank you.
Anyway, I love that we go back so
Mhm.
many years. I go back a long time in just the pioneering. When I began, I had no idea I would go this path. But in the late 70s, there was not a lot of, that's when I first came to faith. Had always loved to dance and had, had taken some classes. I was not highly trained at that time, but I fell in love with Jesus. And I didn't really sing well. I didn't play an instrument, but I could dance. And that was my expression of love and worship. And fortunately, at that time, I had a pastor in a very small charismatic church in Tarpon Springs, Florida, who loved Jesus as well. And he was open to the arts, and he was open to creating a platform for these young people that were coming in on the tail end of the Jesus movement to integrate into community, but to integrate into community in their expressive way. So in that regard, I'm so thankful that was my first encounter with a pastor that would allow such a thing to happen on Sunday mornings. So that's how I began. And then shortly after that, a few years, 1983, I went to Israel for the first time and met international dancers that were coming to faith, that were using dance as an expression. I thought that was just the most amazing thing. I could not believe it. And so in Israel, there was this huge international conference that would bring singers, musicians, and dancers from all over the world to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a biblical feast that was celebrated by the Christian embassy there. They had begun their first work in 1980 when the embassy was moved to Tel Aviv. And so they had a presence, and they were the pioneers of this big international conference. And so that's how I began. In 1984, I was a dancer on that stage. And, roll out the years, I was a dancer from 84. I finally retired in 2010, but through that time became a dancer, one of the major choreographers, and then finally the director. And then in between that, and in being involved with Israel were many other international connections. And so that's when I began to get invitations to different countries, and then of course in the United States, and just beginning to pioneer the concept that dance was a viable worship expression. And it did have a place. In many years past, had a place in the church, had lost its place, and it was now time to return to its place. So in a nutshell, that is, that's kind of my story. And I've had 40 amazing years. And now the pulse beat of my heart is to impart to the next generation, to be their greatest cheerleader. And to do things like this, to share wisdom and to share experiences, both the negative ones and the positive ones. And also, I guess the greatest message is just don't quit.
Yeah.
Just choose not to stop, to choose to continue to grow, and change and learn. And so that's why I loved your questions.
Yeah, so encouraging. Yeah, so encouraging. Thank you. Well, we'll jump into that first question. And basically, it's just looking at this whole idea of cultivating listening skills. And I'd love to learn more about what you've cultivated. How have you learned to listen to the voice of God or heartbeat of God? And how do you define that for yourself?
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to share. Learning to listen, for me, and I think for others, it requires stillness. It requires being comfortable with who you are and just being still. And I have two modes of my listening. I have absolute stillness, where early morning times, I don't really I don't even listen to music early in the morning. I mean, it is total quiet, total stillness. And that's one of the ways that I receive and tune into God speaking to me. And then I have sort of what I call active stillness, which I know is a misnomer, but I'm a walker, I'm a mover. And so I love to walk. And I find that just walking frees my mind. And the thing about listening is that in stillness, whether it's sort of an active stillness that maybe your body's moving but your mind is free, or an inactive stillness where you're just so internally focused that you're just trying to sense from the deepest part of you that listening piece, which, they both have a dynamic to it. But the stillness part, it takes stillness to be able to create space for hearing. And in hearing and creating the space with stillness is where we get creative ideas. It's where we receive revelation. It's where we're able to really and truly be more free in our thought life. It expands our capacity to receive when we still ourselves. Now, it's not easy to still yourself. It is a practiced discipline, a very practiced discipline. And I feel a very important part of that stilled discipline is the Word of God, having God's Word to meditate on. And one of my personal practices is, this is what I'm doing right now currently. I've done it many different ways, but currently I'm taking the book of Psalms, and I'm taking one psalm a week. And in my most still, inactive stillness place, I just take portions of that psalm and ask the Lord to invite me into what it is that he wants me to see in that passage, or where is it where is it supposed to resonate with me on this day? Because his word is alive and it's active. And so you'd think you'd get bored with one psalm for a whole week, but not really, because there are different things to see out of them. And sometimes there's a pattern, sometimes there's an intercession, sometimes there's just a comfort. I mean, I don't dictate. I don't go in trying to find something. I go in to still myself and allow God to speak to me. And I think that is the difference.
Yeah. And that's a different approach at times, because we're so driven by the end result. We're so driven by, I'm going to still myself.
Culture. Absolutely. And so making space for silence creates more space for new ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my sort of walking stillness, where I just free up my mind after I've sort of stilled my soul and fed it and asked God to show me what he wants to see out of that. Then my sort of active stillness is I try to clear my mind, and it's easier for me to clear my mind when I'm moving. And then all kinds of ideas. I mean, that's choreographic ideas I've received that way, ideas for teaching, different ways to see a problem that I might be having interpersonally. It just creates the space for that to be able to come. I think this whole concept of stillness takes an ability to embrace both mystery and discipline. It takes discipline to make yourself be still. It just does. Mm-hmm. And in that stillness, I think the mysteries of the word, the mysteries of God's Spirit talking to us can happen. And I just can sort of liken it to dance, since that's the art discipline that I know. But the whole concept of dance, I mean, just technically, is to work so hard to make it look so effortless. And so there is this, there's this sort of mystical part of dance that makes it look like magic in terms of defying gravity and suspension. I mean, you're playing with all of these dynamics that everybody has to deal with living on the earth. So you're working really, really hard to make it look like you can fly, the mystery part of it. But the discipline, unless you put in the discipline, yes, you can't. So I really think this whole listening for God, listening to his voice is both effortless and definitely lots of discipline. Mm-hmm. It's just both. It's the tension between both of those.
That's beautiful. That's so beautiful and encouraging. And as you mentioned, that component of dance and how that can be a parallel, it's in those still moments in dance that can be so incredibly powerful and profound. But Absolutely. We don't always feel comfortable in that. And it's the same in conversation. If you have a little lull in the conversation or pause, it feels uncomfortable because it feels idle. But in seasoned relationships, to really allow time and space for that quietness, it doesn't mean that you've dropped off. It just means that you're pondering or thinking and not always in such a hurry to respond quickly with something else to say. And so I do believe all that parallels our relationship with the Lord.
The thing about, you hit on such a wonderful point, the thing about in that pause, when we're not comfortable with it, we fill it, and we fill it with ourselves. Or our own ideas, yes, or nervous chatter, yes, or we fill it with non-essentials. Yep. And so if we can learn to embrace that pregnant pause, yes, allow God then to speak out of the pause, yes, both personally and in our art form,
Yes.
oh my goodness, it gives him space, which isn't that the point?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So much smarter than we are. Let him talk, and just us maybe cut back a little.
Yes, that's beautiful. Yes, great. A lot to think on there. That's wonderful reflection. Well, let's move to the next question, looking at probably even just leading into this idea of listening, other important leadership skills to cultivate and other leadership qualities to cultivate. So listening, I believe, so far nobody's disagreed that that's really a valuable one. What other ones would you encourage and believe yourself in cultivating?
Well, I think listening to learn, which is the second part, which is a brilliant second part, by the way. Listening to learn, I think the key to listening to learn is a spirit of humility. Knowing that you can learn something from everyone that you come in contact with. So I think humility is a real key to listening to learn from others. I think when we're listening to others, we can listen to connect, or we can listen to impress. And when we listen to connect, we're listening with our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
When we listen to connect, to impress, we are listening with our minds. So, if I am genuinely listening to you, to connect with you, then I focus on what it is you're saying. Mm-hmm. And I focus on your intention, and I'm connecting to you. I'm even if we're in disagreement, I'm still trying to connect in a way that I can understand. I'm saying I don't know everything. Mm-hmm. I know what my convictions are, and I know how I feel about this, but I'm going to listen to learn something, even if I don't agree with it. And so I'm going to listen to you in a whole different way. And you know what? I might learn something that I didn't know. If I listen to you in an inactive way, for me, I call that active listening. Mm-hmm. Active listening to learn. If I listen to you inactively, then I can let my mind wander. If I don't think I can learn anything from you, I can have a nice face, I can keep eye contact, but I could be thinking about, gosh, I wish this was over, or wow, she's really missing this, or I need to go to the grocery store. Do you know what I'm saying? I can let all my thoughts wander. Or I can be thinking with a rebuttal, like, how am I going to turn this around to something that the point that I want to make? Mm-hmm. So I'm in my head. Mm-hmm. I'm not in my heart. Mm-hmm. So humility for me is that key.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Listening to learn.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I
so
think
a question that we can ask ourselves is, do we listen to learn from others with our head or with our heart?
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think a part of that is another phrase that's been used in kind of pop psychology. It's just this idea of being present.
Yes.
And that's not a new pop term, needing to be present. God's done it for eons of years. And I love what you're saying. And I think about it in the context of relationship with God. When God listens to me, he never is wanting to impress me.
No.
Because he doesn't have to prove anything. Because he's God. And so it made me think, in your listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, this is how God actively engages with me. And my pursuit in life is to become more like God. I've got a lot to learn to be like God in that way and to be present in that way. So it's a good beautiful reminder. Really beautiful reminder. Are you ready to move to the next question? Are we okay?
I do, before we move, we're learning to listen, listening to learn. But I also want to mention that our bodies can talk to us. And we, I just wanted to throw in this point, because I know we have talked about this whole thing about, keeping our body, being stewards over this gift that God has given us for the long, for the long road. And one of the questions I would ask those who are listening, if your body could talk to you, we know that God's talking to us, we're talking to God, we're trying to listen, He's listening to us. But if our bodies, purely our bodies, could talk to us, what would they say? Would they say, I need coffee, like I'm 1 second from being burned out? What is your body saying? I had one of the most incredible experiences this summer. I walked a portion of the El Camino in Spain with my grandson. And so you just walk for hours. Like I walked from 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you're walking through the countryside of Spain, through these 12th century villages and through sheep pastures. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. It was an incredible experience. But there are other people that are doing it, but basically you are alone with your thoughts all day long. And so I had plenty of time to ponder and to talk to God. And so I'm looking around and just taking in my environment, trying to be present. And I noticed, I come to this realization: there is one common denominator on every single person on this Camino, whether they're young, old, and whatever ethnicity they are. Everybody has a backpack. Everybody that walks the Camino walks with a backpack. And so mine was giving me a lot of difficulty. And so every night I would take more things out of it. I was always adjusting it. And so one of the things that I felt like the Lord was showing me is that, we all carry something. We all have burdens. We all in a fallen world carry something. But His yoke is easy and His burden is light. And so many times we carry things that we were not designed to carry, but we carry them along anyway. And so in all of this adjusting with my backpack and fighting with my backpack, what was screaming most loudly was my body, was my back. And I just realized when we are not aligned properly, when we're not in that place where we're listening, where we're taking enough stillness time, when we're not, listening to learn, when all of these things, it's our body that starts screaming. Pay attention, take a look at. And one of the things I think we most want to do is just to numb it or, try to hide in it or something. I don't know. But so that would be my other listening question. I'm full of rhetorical questions today, but if your body could talk, what's it saying to you right now?
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And I just will basically say thank you for that. And maybe sometime I'll follow up with some other education and teaching about that, because in the season of life, more than ever before, I'm really tying in, as you know, this whole understanding of it's not separated and it's not compartmentalized. Our body, our soul, and spirit are like this, and our body speaks all the time, as does our, our spirit and our soul, mind, will, emotions. And so, thank you, and that will maybe give me a little incentive to get some other sort of teaching that I can share around that and hear from others, obviously, as well. But let's look at this next question about just because admittedly you've been doing this for some years and you've seen some different experiences and trends and expressions and cultural just offerings in dance. Where do you feel like, and how do you feel like God is moving through the arts today? And that can be compared to these 40 years or just focusing on today. And what do you feel like are ways that you yourself are recognizing that and making contributions? And obviously you already said that you're wanting to impart and encourage and inspire this next generation, but just would love to hear a bit more about how do you feel like God's moving currently in the arts?
Well, let me say something about leadership first, and then I'm going to pull right into that. First of all, I believe that leadership is influence, and influence can create action. Influence makes things happen. In that regard, I believe that we are all leaders because we all have a realm or a sphere of influence. Everybody has a sphere of influence because we're so interconnected. But it's some spheres are small, some are large. But leadership is influence in whatever sphere you find yourself. We've also all been given gifting. God has created all of us. Now, I know there's some 10 talent Christians, there's some 5, some 2, but it doesn't matter how many. We do need to recognize that we're all given gifting and we're all given a measure of influence. And so in the arts, particularly, because this is what we're talking about, another rhetorical question I would have is, what are you doing in your sphere of influence with the gifting that God has given you? How are you stewarding this? And for me, I felt like my mandate 40 years ago was to bring an acceptance, to bring a validity of dance as a true expression of the heart in worship, that it was a way beyond words or beyond notes or beyond singing to express what was in the heart of a worshiper, not just in an artistic realm, but also to release those in the congregation for a fuller expression of their worship, that they just weren't relegated to sit in a chair or behind a pew, that they had also permission to express. And it was during that season, or the implements that God gave us during that, as extensions of expressions. That's when flags and banners and all of these wonderful biblical expressions and biblical tools sort of came back into expression in the church. And so that's what, that's where I lived, my most of my ministry life, in that expression, but also in training, in training in the craft, in really taking seriously the concept that dance is a nonverbal language, and that for it to be understood or for it to be experienced, then it had to be crafted in the most excellent way. I mean, everybody had a different level, but there had to be a pursuit of excellence in crafting what it is that you were trying to express, especially if you were demonstrating. If it was just a personal expression in a small space, then, but if it was going to be brought as into a form of message or into a form of communication, then it needed crafting, it needed thought, it needed that sort of containment in order to be effective, to be effective for people. So within that, and within all the international travel, then I started, being open to other cultural expressions, because cultures have vocabulary, just like their languages are different, their movement is different. And I know that you know this, but to make room, again, humility has got to be the key for a leader that has that, has that kind of exposure. Not trying to bring my Western concept of what was happening, but to see what was happening in their context, and then, then becoming one with it, and yes, maybe shaping it, but exploring it together. So that's, that was my background. What I see a whole, well, first of all, in this current Western dance that I'm seeing, the movement vocabulary is much, much different, and rightly so, than the vocabulary that I was working with as a 20-year-old, 20-year-old, 30-year-old. The vocabulary is different. It's a different expression. And I've learned to appreciate it. I think one danger, or I don't know, one challenge, I don't think it's a danger. I think one challenge is that it can get so introspective that only the person doing it really knows what they're trying to say. So I think that's fine if you're just into releasing, but if you're into communicating, I think you have to think more broadly than that. How is my audience receiving it? Are they understanding what it is that I'm trying to say? So in that regard, I think it's important for artists that are trying to communicate with whatever vocabulary they have, to think outside of just personal expression, if you're trying to engage and you want to garner others to share in this expression with you, or to touch them in ways. I think you have to be mindful of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
comment on that before I keep going on.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I mean, even I'm just looking at that tapestry behind you, and it's so beautiful and has so many colors, and it is a piece of art. And what I'm understanding you to say is, when we have this mandate to intentionally communicate something, maybe in a message, or depending on where our environment or setting is, it's just being aware that we have to adhere to being able to communicate to our audience or to our community things that they can comprehend and understand. And there is a place also for artistic expression, like Jesus spoke in the parables. There's things that are still mysterious that people will debate about, theologians will debate about, because they don't understand the full interpretation. And so there are the mysteries of God that can be relayed artistically, that might evoke feeling or thought or consideration. And you can have a dozen people look at that art, visual art, or that dance, or listen to that piece of music, and those dozen people will all have different interpretations. So there is a place for that, is what I'm hearing you say. And there's also a place when you are expecting to be able to comprehend what's being, the information given to you. So it's that balance of, when are we spoon feeding, when are we fork feeding? And I believe as artists, we have the mandate that if we are constantly just bottle feeding or spoon feeding, we aren't helping our congregation, our audience, our fellow believers or community to cultivate that understanding themselves, and how can they chew on something a little bit, and to know that there's not always just this right or wrong answer, or right or wrong
absolutely. But whether it is, whether it's concrete or whether it's ethereal, I still think but I think as artists, we then still need to be mindful of what it is. I mean, if we're trying to evoke, a feeling or to touch a place, I still think it's thoughtful through our art to know what it is that we're trying to communicate. It may not be a concrete image, but you're mindful that you are trying to create this. One of the things that I think, our history, our culture, our society is shaped, our art reflects all of those things. I ran across this quote. I'm going to look at my notes because I want to read it correctly. Art transforms through the ages depending on the environment. And I just think that's a thought-provoking statement, that art transforms, depending on the environment. And I think our present culture, not God's culture, but our present secular culture is bereft of truth and beauty. I just think there is such a poverty of truth and beauty. I just do. And I think as Christian artists in particular, that's a substance of what we can deliver, mm-hmm. is truth and beauty. Mm-hmm. He is both all truth and he is magnificently beautiful. Mm-hmm. And even in themes of struggle, mm-hmm. to be able to present something redemptive out of that's the gain out of loss. And our whole, I haven't thought this, I probably shouldn't even mention it because it's just my ponderable today from my active walking. But this whole concept of the Christian walk being all about gains and losses and gains. I mean, Jesus says, you've got to lose your life to gain it. That's where it begins. But we are constantly losing and gaining, and the losses are painful. This whole thing in the Bahamas has just, it's caused me to weep. I mean, it's just touched me in such a deep area because it's so devastating. And yet I know God is good. And so I know the tension between this loss and some kind of gain on this side. I know and believe in a God that is good, that there's truth and beauty between these two. I feel without that, without that viewpoint, without that being able to be expressed, a secular worldview is that it's just devastating, and there's no hope in the devastation. I just couldn't, I don't think I could live my life out in a world like that. I really don't. I think I would want to either numb myself or do myself away with. I just don't believe we can live without hope. And hope is inspired by truth and beauty. And it makes life a beautiful thing. And so that would, whatever young artist might be listening, to this, that's where I just want to cheer you on, create out of that wellspring that's truth and that's beauty. But to get there, one of the ways to get there is to learn to be still, mm-hmm. and to learn to listen and to meditate on the Word of God, which is full of truth and beauty. Even in its darkest moments, it's always redemptive. It's always leading to this character of God, his goodness, his mercy, his sovereignty, his control of all things, his majesty, all of these things that are him. Feed your soul with those things, and then let your art reflect that and influence your culture with the gift that God has given you steward over.
That's just such an encouragement. And some of this I feel like I'm going to need to listen over and over to, just to get all this nuggets of truth and just the discernment and just the charge to really
bring truth and beauty into a culture of poverty. I mean, we are the richest nation in the world, but we are one of the most impoverished in some ways in our secular culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in closing, I'd love for this audience, to be able to know you've written a book recently and had that published, and to
Yes.
share a bit about that. And then I'll make sure that I put links to be able to connect with you if they'd like to have you come in as a teacher or an educator, to learn where they can get access to that book. So would you share some about that?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. The name of the book is Beyond the Dance, and you can find it on Amazon. I have some copies hanging around here that I can, get you, but you can go on Amazon and just get it, in a few days. And it's a sort of a collage of my experiences from, beginning this whole pioneering venture, and different places and different things that God has taught me all along the way. I trust it will be a good read for you, and I would love to connect. I mean, just through email or in any way. But for you young artists, I'm with you. You don't know me, but I'm for you. I'm really for you.
I love it.
Well, cheerleader here in Florida.
Yeah, we appreciate that for sure. That, and you and I've had great conversations about where we are in this season of life, and knowing how much hope there is and excitement, and it's just exceeded what we imagined 30 plus years ago, with now this proliferation of dance and dancers and faith-filled artists, and it's just incredible.
I can't believe what we're seeing.
I know.
I just cannot believe.
Yeah.
I knew one other dancer in the whole United States in the 70s.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. And look where we are now. Praise be to God.
I know.
Well, my friend, this is such an honor to have this time with you, and thank you for your words of wisdom. And it's so evident your love well is deep, and I pray that people will take advantage of listening and sharing this, and also getting your book and reading all of those continued nuggets that you share there, and reach out to you as well. So thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, friend. You always pull good stuff out of me. I love talking with you.
I love you too.
Bye.